Anastasia, well, that's funny and sad at the same time. It means that people in society are fighting, brawling, and arguing over mere epithets of the one who is one and the same for everyone. Rigdon, unfortunately, without even understanding the single spiritual essence for all the peoples, for mankind as a whole. That is why, knowing the human nature, initially the designation of the One, as I said before, was given to people not under his name but under the sound Ra, which symbolized the concept of the One, the Eternal, Supreme. That is why since ancient times, even conditional designation of God among the people initiated in this knowledge did not mention his name. By the way, this applies also to the ring finger. It is much later, when discord began in society among people, which was fueled by priests, that various interpretations and divisions into our and their gods appeared and so on, eventually leading to loss of the primordial knowledge. But all these are deeds of humanity. But let us get back to the topic of rings. The first rings were simple and smooth. By the way, earlier such rings used by the initiated were made exclusively out of crystal as an energy and information accumulator. Anastasia, that is, of natural material in which the elementary particles, atoms, ions, and molecules, are located according to the geometric laws of spatial facets and crystal lattices and have mostly geometrically correct form and structure, for instance, polyhedrons, which have already been mentioned in the conversation. In general, one can say that this is, again, a sign only not of the two-dimensional but of three-dimensional space, where the external form reflects the symmetry of the inner laying of the elementary particles and, consequently, the distribution of energies which form them. Rigdon, certainly. And later, when people began to lose the knowledge, in order to make such rings, they started to use hard rock stones, wood, or bone. Much later, they used to be made of metal. So, the first rings in the ancient secret societies were simple, and the only difference was on which hand they were worn, the left one or the right one. But after, as they say, an information leak occurred and ordinary people started imitating the attributes of the initiates, rings began to be worn widely in society without understanding the essence, on different fingers, making them of various metals, decorating them with precious stones and so on. Then, the initiates started depicting certain signs and symbols on their rings, which were understandable to their social circle. For example, those belonging to the light forces would wear a ring on the ring finger of his or her right hand, and the ring had a shape of a serpent biting its tail, with its head located clockwise. Whereas a follower of the dark forces would wear a ring on the ring finger of his or her left hand. On such a ring, the serpent's head was located, on the contrary, counterclockwise. But this also did not last long. Soon, because of human imitation and the distortion of knowledge, such a conventionality as ring-wearing lost its meaning among those who were involved in the primordial knowledge. However, the tradition of wearing rings as an adornment or a symbol of certain privileges continued among people. People came up with numerous ways of boasting in front of each other, starting with devising made-up super magic signet rings, which supposedly protected a person against diseases and troubles or gave power, and ending with symbols of social inequality in the form of a ring of a rich person, an honorary citizen. Generally speaking, everything as per usual, human pride without reason. Anastasia, I would like to illuminate another interesting question in connection with the raised topic of ring finger and rings. Once you talked about the origin of the expression, the finger of God, translator's note, from which, in fact, the concept of signet ring is derived. Rigdon, yes, the old Slavonic word prst means finger. Moreover, the ring finger of the right hand was earlier called prst. To this day, some peoples, for instance, the Kazakhs, still have a custom associated with the ancient popular belief that newborn children should be first given not the mother's breast to suckle but a ring finger in order to ensure the baby to grow into a good, kind, and spiritual person. These are actual echoes, although in human interpretation, of the mentioned knowledge about the conventional symbolism of the ring finger. Nowadays, ring wearing is a mere fashion and tradition, for example, to put on wedding rings on ring fingers of either the right or the left hand, depending on the country. Nonetheless, echoes of the knowledge once possessed by people can still be found. For instance, in Orthodoxy, at the wedding, the ring that newlyweds put on the ring fingers of their right hands still denote the sign of eternity and inseparability of the nuptial crown with the spiritual world. Anastasia, the majority of people do not even stop and think about why there are different traditions they follow and from where the root of such traditions grows. But when you understand such details, other information also becomes more clear. For example, what the connection of this finger with another one means in sculptures or images of deities, including as a conditional indication of meditative techniques. Rigden, as for the position of fingers. If the ring finger, according to meditative functions, symbolized spiritual vision, knowledge, and superpowers, then the thumb symbolized the energy potential of man himself. In particular, the thumb indicated that the chakran located approximately in the lower abdomen, inside the pelvic girdle, between the tailbone and the pubic symphysis, was involved in the meditation. Externally on the diagrams of man, it was conditionally depicted in the crotch area. But this is only conditional since it is the human energy body and not the physical one that was meant here. Figure 93. Schematic drawing of the Muladhara chakran in India. By the way, in India, this chakran is called Muladhara. Muladhara is a word derived from Sanskrit, where in the English transcription mula means a root, base, while adhara is a foundation, basis, support. This chakran is associated also with the awakening of the human energy potential. Traditionally, it has been marked with red color. In the East, the awakening of this powerful energy potential is called the awakening of the sleeping Kundalini serpent coiled by 3.5 turns. I already mentioned this energy more than once as I was speaking about the helical, spiral, structures. Since ancient times, this power has been considered the feminine aspect of the divine power, AllatRA, and later in Christianity, some of its properties began to be attributed to the Holy Spirit. It helped to awaken a powerful, creative force of spiritual love in a person, which does not come even close to any physical sensations or manifestations of raw energies. In India, this chakran was often equated to the home of Brahman. It was considered that the power concealed in this energy center exists in each person, although in a dormant state. This power awakens only when the person works on himself and on taming his animal nature and strives for the spiritual nature to dominate in him. In Christianity, ascetics, the Greek word ascesis meaning an exercise, a practice, call this stage of spiritual development the attainment of the state of dispassion. That is, the state outside the influence of passions and desires, the state of rejection of evil intentions and deeds on the path of virtue, the state of purity of the mind. Without this inner work on oneself, no spiritual tool will yield a proper result. In the East, the result of the awakening of Kundalini is regarded as a qualitative change of the human consciousness, a spiritual awakening, an intuitive perception of the truth. And in Christianity, this stage is already called the state of dispassion itself, when the mind enters the supersensual, and the one attaining is transported to the land of knowledge, where the mind abides as a dwelling in the Spirit of God. In the East, this is considered to be a very powerful impetus for the transformation of the personality, the ascent of the Kundalini energy from the base of the spine through the center of the head to the Supreme, to its fusion with the Divine One. When consciousness merges with the One and the state becomes permanent, liberation comes. In that same Christianity, for example, the attainment of the supreme spiritual state is called blessing, and it is regarded as a universal value, the ultimate frontier of the human aspiration, the journey towards which involves goodness as the personal property of the Holy Spirit. Moreover, it is specified that this special state, which cannot be attained by any usual feeling for a common person, is inaccessible to the imagination and surpasses any logical thinking, it does not fit in the mind. In other words, it can be attained only by working on oneself spiritually, in an altered state of consciousness, in the absence of thoughts and imagination, solely with the deepest feelings, the sixth sense, which is unknown to an ordinary person. God is considered to be the greatest good, that unchangeable, everlasting, and immortal which contains the supreme power and wisdom. 1-2. Figure 94. Conditional designation of the main chakrans in the attainment of the supreme state of liberation. Modern traditional schematic representation of the human being in the lotus position with 7 chakrans. Schematic representation of attainment of the state of spiritual liberation on a Tripoli ritual jug. The position of the women's hands indicates the connection of the first and the seventh chakrans. It is that good that each human soul strives for. In essence, this is exactly the qualitative human transformation and transfiguration of one's energy nature into that form which resembles in the human understanding an energy cube standing on one of its corners. Anastasia, yes, this gesture of connecting the ring finger with the thumb as a symbol of connection of God's power with the energy potential of human being itself, moreover from Jesus Christ himself as God's Son, is indeed a real gesture of a blessing of mankind. Rigdon, furthermore, in the icon Christ in Majesty, Spas v Silik, Jesus is portrayed against the background of geometric shapes. In particular, in the background, there is a red square, on the corners of which a winged man, a lion, a calf, and an eagle are located. Anastasia, that is, the symbols of the 4 essences against the background of a red square. Rigdon, yes. Nowadays, in Christianity, these images, tetramorphs, are interpreted as symbols of evangelists, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, respectively. Because of such priestly interpretation, today few people know about the true nature of these symbols and their origin. And to the flock of this global religion, they are explained in the following way. Matthew is an image of a winged human being. He was a tax collector, and that is why he is usually portrayed with a sum of money, a spear, a sword. Anastasia, well, the image of the human being symbolizes the human nature and desires. It is a traditional allegorical interpretation of the back essence among the ancient Eastern peoples, in the context of the knowledge about the 4 essences. Figure 95. A schematic image of an illustration from Carolingian minuscule, 9th century, discovered in France. A library of Valenciennes the mystic lamb, in the center, and 4 apocalyptic beasts holding a book. Rigdon, absolutely correct, although for a long time now nobody remembers it. Next, comes the symbol of Mark, a lion, the king of animals. The symbol of Luke is a winged calf, where the calf itself is seen as a sacrificial animal. Anastasia, well, already in the Proto-Indian civilization, the calf meant the animal nature, while the majority of ancient peoples associated it with the characteristic of the right essence. And how many old Oriental stories have been dedicated to the fight against the lion and a victory over it as a symbol of taming by man of his cleverest and most power-loving left essence, the support of the animal nature. Rigdon, well, everything is simple when you understand the obvious. And the symbol of John is an eagle. However, in the context of the knowledge about the 4 essences, originally there was another bird. In fact, a falcon should be depicted here, if one follows the original sources, from which priests copied the story for their new religion. For many ancient peoples, including the Egyptians, the bird, falcon, was a symbolical designation of the front essence. The eagle is already a priest's insertion into the information they borrowed from other peoples. But that is already another topic for conversation. So, what is remarkable in the story of the Orthodox icon Christ in Majesty, Spas v Silik? All these zoomorphic creatures are holding a book and are located as symbols at the ends of a secret pattern, a diagonal cross in the form of rays coming from the cube. The latter is symbolically depicted as a rhombus. Generally, a blue, green, oval is placed over the red square in the image, and on top of the oval, there is a red rhombus, as a symbol of transformation of a square into a rhombus, that is, the formation of a cube placed on one of its corners. Anastasia, that's incredible because a cube on a plane in the isometric projection is a regular hexagon, and each of its faces is a rhombus. Everything depends on how you look at it. Rigdon, quite right. In this case, I would say more precisely, everything depends on who exactly is looking. So, on the icon, Jesus sits on the throne against the background of a red cube. What is more, one of his feet is stepping onto the corner of this cube, and the other foot is placed inside the blue oval. In Christianity, the latter is also called an almond-shaped halo or a fish maw, and it is regarded as a symbol of the divine might which surrounds Christ during his resurrection and transformation. In this blue, green, oval, there are seraphs, originally in red color, and cherubs, originally in blue color, as symbols of the celestial hierarchy. And each of them is depicted in the form of a face surrounded by 6 wings. Think of the guises, schematic images of human faces, on the large Shajir idol which symbolize dimensions. And such a conditional designation of other dimensions was typical not only for the Shajir culture, the 5th to 4th millennium BC, the Middle Urals and Trans-Urals, modern Russia, but also for the Okonaa culture in South Siberia, the 2nd millennium BC, and other ancient cultures, long before the emergence of Christianity and the world religions that are known today. By the way, the Okonaa culture is quite rich in signs and symbols in the form of circles, spirals, and triangles as well as stylized anthropomorphic figures, images of falcons, female goddesses, and symbolic spiritual signs, of Allat. Such designations were quite widespread in the ancient world. So, returning to the conversation about the icon Christ in Majesty, Spas v Silik. The color combination of red and blue in Christianity is also seen as joining the human nature with the divine nature of Jesus Christ. And the very image of Christ is regarded as a symbol of his new, future theophany to people as the Lord of the visible and the invisible worlds, a symbol of unknowable and embodiment. Figure 96. Arrangement of symbols. On the icon Christ in Majesty, Spas v Silik, 1408, painter Andrei Rublev. A lion. A blue, green, oval, sphere. The throne on which Christ is sitting as a judge. The blessing gesture, connection of the ring finger with the thumb of the right hand. A winged person. Jesus Christ in a golden garment. An eagle. Seraphs and cherubs. An open book. A red rhombus. A red square into which a blue, green, oval is inscribed. A bull. Christ's foot is stepping on a corner of the red rhombus. Anastasia, yes, for knowledgeable people this is an amazing icon in its symbolism. The square as a symbol of the earthly with 4 essences, the rhombus as a symbol of the cube standing on one of its corners, of the 7th dimension, a symbol of the human spiritual transformation and liberation. The oval denotes personal energy space between a person and his essences, the connection with other worlds, dimensions. Christ is inside the red rhombus, that is, in the 7th dimension, paradise, the 7th sky, and he is also blessing with such a significant gesture of the right hand. This has all the basic knowledge about human and his spiritual capabilities on the way to God. This is another confirmation of the fact that when you possess knowledge, you can maturely understand the key essence of information recorded by people in the past. Rigdon, in principle, such a method of knowledge transmittal has been used since ancient times. Moreover, as a rule, such, so to say, basic knowledge was placed in plain view. Suffice it to look at the signs and symbols that surround us in our lives, or at traditional religious images, or look into the history of arts of the peoples of the world in order to understand that this knowledge has always existed. Anastasia, you're right. As far as I know, the icon Christ in Majesty, Spas v Silik, has been in the very middle of the iconostasis of the Cathedral of the Annunciation in the Moscow Kremlin since the 14th century to this day. But the question is who sees it? In the Christian religion, Christ in Majesty, Spaz v. Silik, symbolizes a complex theological concept of what Christ will be like when he appears at the end of times in his full power and glory for the last judgment and the future transformation of the universe, in order to fulfill a disposition of providence about the world, in order to unite everything earthly and heavenly under the head of Christ. Rigdon, this icon is considered to be a kind of an entire treatise in symbolism, a prophecy of the future in the language of icon painting. Anastasia, interestingly, a special emphasis here is placed on the book. During the second coming, Christ is holding an open book, and all the zoomorphic figures are holding a book each. Is gospel meant here, or does the symbol indicate some common allegorical meaning? I know that since the early days of Christianity, Jesus Christ has been symbolically depicted as a book, onto which a turtle dove descends as a manifestation of the Holy Spirit. I also wondered why it is the turtle dove that is often mentioned in the Bible. It turns out that it is different from the pigeon, smaller in size and is a migratory bird. The turtle dove would appear in Palestine in early spring. It was considered to be the first messenger, a pure bird. Rigdon, that is really so. I will say even more, originally in early Christianity the Holy Spirit was depicted as a white turtle dove, later as a she-dove, but not as a pigeon. Since it was a symbol of divine love, the creating feminine principle, the foremother of all things, AllatRA. And this is connected with even more ancient knowledge, when the Divine Trinity was presented as Father, Mother, and Son. For example, such a triad existed in ancient Egypt, Osiris, Isis, Horus. Later in Christianity, the turtle dove, the she-dove in other images, began to be depicted mainly on paintings of the Annunciation, in the context of portraying the story with Archangel Gabriel and the Virgin Mary, and the baptism of Christ. Regarding the book, your observation is correct. It is the fact of the presence of a book as such that is emphasized, moreover in its open form, that is, as available for reading. In the Christian culture, the symbolism of the book is quite significant and deep, so everyone drew it on the basis of generally accepted canons. It could be the Glad Tidings, the Book of Life with the names of the saved ones, the Book of Revelation about the prophecies of the second coming of Christ. By the way, in the last one, there is a story about the book written inside and outside, sealed with 7 seals, which cannot be opened and read by anyone other than the Lamb. It also speaks about 4 animals, the guardians around the throne and so on. Anastasia, please remind those readers for whom this topic is significant, where exactly in the Revelation one can find the story about the book and the 4 animals. Rigdon, in the Bible, KJV, this is the 4th and subsequent chapters in the Revelation of John. For example, the 4th chapter contains the following lines, and in the midst of the throne and round about the throne were 4 beasts full of eyes before and behind. And the first beast was like a lion, and the second beast like a calf, and the third beast had a face as a man, and the 4th beast was like a flying eagle. And the 4 beasts had each of them 6 wings about him, and they were full of eyes within. And chapter 5 speaks about the book, and I saw in the right hand of him that sat on the throne a book written within and on the backside, sealed with 7 seals. And I saw a strong angel proclaiming with a loud voice, Who is worthy to open the book, and to loose the seals thereof? And no one in heaven, nor in the earth, neither under the earth, was able to open the book, neither to look thereon. And I beheld, and, lo, in the midst of the throne and of the 4 beasts, and in the midst of the elders, stood a lamb as it had been slain, having 7 horns and 7 eyes, which are the 7 spirits of God sent forth into all the earth. And he came and took the book out of the right hand of him that sat upon the throne. And when he had taken the book, the 4 beasts and 24 elders fell down before the Lamb, having every one of them harps, and golden vials full of odors, which are the prayers of saints. And they sung a new song, saying, Thou art worthy to take the book, and to open the seals thereof, for thou wast slain, and hast redeemed us to God by thy blood out of every kindred, and tongue, and people, and nation, and hast made us unto our God kings and priests, and we shall reign on the earth. And I beheld, and I heard the voice of many angels round about the throne and the beasts and the elders, and the number of them was 10,000 times 10,000, and thousands of thousands, saying with a loud voice, Worthy is the Lamb that was slain to receive power, and riches, and wisdom, and strength, and honor, and glory, and blessing. And every creature which is in heaven, and on the earth, and under the earth, and such as are in the sea, and all that are in them, heard I saying, Blessing, and honor, and glory, and power, be unto him that sitteth upon the throne, and unto the Lamb forever and ever. And the four beasts said, Amen. And the 24 elders fell down and worshipped him that liveth forever and ever. Anastasia, yes, now these lines do sound in a completely different light of an expanded understanding of the essence of what is happening. Rigdon, actually, I once mentioned that the sacred book in the sacred symbolism is regarded as a record of sacred symbols, which indicate the word of God, the sound of creation, that was revealed to the world. For example, the ancient Egyptians considered hieroglyphs as sacred signs that implied entire concepts and sometimes individual sounds. Later a simplified writing system appeared, which became applicable not only in religious but also in secular texts. What are, for example, modern letters in different languages? They are, in fact, conventional signs invented by people. Their various combination is a kind of conditional code for understanding this or that information. Moreover, any conventional sign is neutral by itself. But in different combinations, even a conventional sign becomes part of a peculiar information portal for the conduction and action of this or that power and will. But all this, let us call it informational space, activates and begins to work only when a person applies his power to it, attention, awareness, by reading this code. For example, when a person sees a closed book and does not know what is written in it, its conventional signs are in a neutral state. But as soon as he begins to read, if he understands these conventional signs, this is exactly the initial application of power for activating this informational space. But what is very important is what dominates a person at that moment and what is the power of this application, that is, what is the nature of its origin. For example, a person is reading a modern book, good fiction. But at that moment, the animal nature dominates in him, selfishness, anger, hatred, and so on. Accordingly, even when reading a good, kind book, its contents will irritate him, make him angry, amuse and entertain his megalomania with primitiveness, cause envy and indignation. He will choose those points in it which satisfy his ego. In other words, the conventional signs written in the book will contribute to a greater activation of the power that prevails in a person at that moment, that is, of the will pursuant to a program from the animal nature. And if spiritual nature dominates in the person at that moment, another side will open to him. Not only will he enrich himself with the information, but he will also be able to sort it out maturely. He may be able to realize the origin of certain sources of power the author himself inserted through the code of conventional signs, activated by him. Anastasia, so, that same book but which one reads, as they say, with the love of God in their soul, will make it possible to understand the information embedded in it without bias, comprehend the essence, to feel and recognize the source of its origin. In other words, the book is a conditional information code and its perception depends on the dominant choice of the person himself. Rigdon, that is right. These conditional informational codes, words and sentences, are recorded in the book by people who, at the time of recording them, writing the book, were dominated by one or another power, or rather, the will from either the spiritual world or from the animal mind. If the person does not know these conditional codes, for example, the language in which the book is written, of course, he will not be able to read it. But if he knows them and, accordingly, activates them, then he will feel the effect of this activation, that is, an influence upon him of the power of that will. Anastasia, in other words, if you are dominated by the animal nature, then, Even while reading spiritual treatises, you'll miss the most important points, you'll deny everything and won't understand anything because of narrowed consciousness at that moment. And if you are dominated by the spiritual nature, then you will perceive any book in the state of an expanded perception of the world, which will make it easy to separate the wheat from the chaff and understand the writer's dominant motives, who put what in there and for what purpose all this was done. Rigdon, yes, that is to say, when consciousness is dominated by the spiritual nature, which means there is an expanded perception of the world due to the deepest feelings, you begin to understand the true essence and gain wisdom. And through wisdom comes knowledge. Knowledge, as a sign code, during the activation of which by the spiritual nature, conditions form not only for the transformation of the personality but also of the world that surrounds it. Therefore, the book and the information encoded in it are, in fact, a conductor of the will, from either the spiritual world or the animal mind. Information codes belong to exchangeable information, they are neutral until a person activates them and comes into a resonance with their power. These conventional signs of writing were invented by people. They must not be confused with the original active working signs, which have been introduced into this world from the outside. These are completely different concepts and different signs. Anastasia, do you mean those original signs? Rigdon, absolutely. I mean exactly those original 18 working signs that still exist in the human society. 9 positive creating signs, introduced from the spiritual world, and 9 negative working signs, introduced from the animal mind. These signs are active regardless of the person and his dominant desires and powers. They are active by themselves, that is, they are endowed with power and interact with the surrounding visible and invisible worlds and with the whole complex human structure in 6 dimensions. Anastasia, yes, this information requires deep reflection. Rigdon, and as for information recorded in the symbols of the icon Christ in Majesty, Spas v Silik, in Rus, this knowledge was later disseminated also through the image of the icon of Our Lady of the Burning Bush, Neopalamaya Cupina. So then, the symbolic and allegorical composition of this icon, in the main geometrical details, practically repeats Christ in Majesty, a red square, with 4 evangelists in zoomorphic, apocalyptic images, a human, a lion, a calf, and an eagle, a diagonal cross, a hidden oval, a rhombus, in which the image of the Mother of God, Our Lady, is inscribed, 6 angels in the rhombus. In general, everything is as it should be. Only the geometrical elements are named differently in descriptions, for example, as 2 4-pointed stars overlaying each other, a total of 8 vertices, or as an 8-pointed star with a truncated lower beam. And the rhombus is, as a rule, green or blue, navy blue, in color, while the square under it is red, as it should be. In the center of the composition is the Mother of God, Our Lady, who is holding baby Christ in her left hand, while in her right hand there is a ladder. Sometimes a ladder in such icons touches a shoulder of the Mother of God, and sometimes instead of a ladder, a gate and a rod are drawn as a symbol of the Savior. All this symbolizes that it is the Mother of God that spiritually elevates humanity from earth to heaven. Among the images in this icon, there is also Archangel Gabriel with a symbol of glad tidings, a branch of lily. Figure 97. Image of the icon of Our Lady of the Burning Bush, late 16th century, from the local line of iconostasis of the Transfiguration Cathedral of the Solovetsky Monastery, the Kolomenskoye Moscow Museum Reserve, Russia. Anastasia, yes, this icon is well known to fine art experts, for example, by the image of the 16th century of the icon of Our Lady of the Burning Bush, which originates from a local line of iconostasis of the Transfiguration Cathedral of the Solovetsky Monastery. And many people know about it. Almost every Orthodox family has icons of this kind. Only who among people has paid attention to such sign details? After all, if you ask any person, many people know this icon as the protector of home from fires. At best they will tell you that this icon is based on the biblical story about Moses, when he decided to lead his people out of Egypt, or about a burning blackthorn bush, out of which God called to Moses, and he, as if out of curiosity, went to see why it was on fire but was not consumed by the flames. Rigdon burst out laughing. Though people's words are amusing, the essence in them is the truth. Priests have always been consumed with curiosity and envy about where a truly spiritual being gets so much God's power. What do you think, how Moses, the mother of God, and fires are connected? Anastasia, you know, there is a feeling that all this connection has been created artificially. If we keep to the point, the Mother of God, judging by all the spiritual signs and by the fact how many miracles in the world happened through her image over these thousands of years, this is truly Christ in majesty. Rigdon, that is so. The icon of Our Lady of the Burning Bush, Neopalamaya Cupina, has nothing to do with all these matters of priesthood. And in Rus, it became called so not from the word, Cupina, meaning blackthorn, shrub, but from the old Slavic word, kupa, which means a connection, elevation, a totality of something. And the fact that it got associated with the belief that it protects from fire, well, at least now it is, as you have correctly noticed, found in every home, after becoming famous for performing miracles. But what is more important is that through it, knowledge has been passed down to the majority, even if in such an unpacked form. And it exists now, and this is by no means unimportant. It is no coincidence that Our Lady of the Burning Bush, Neopalamaya Cupina, is associated with the symbol of the Immaculate Conception by God's Mother from the Holy Spirit. This is exactly a symbol of what I told you about. God's Mother is a conductor of the power of God for every person walking the spiritual path. This is the power of God's love, with the help of which the human soul is liberated from earthly reincarnations. Jesus, as a spiritual being from a different world, renewed the true knowledge which got lost in centuries and gave people spiritual tools for spiritual salvation. So, in other words, he left keys. Working on oneself with these tools, a person acquired, figuratively speaking, a key to the sign. And he gave power and signs themselves to God's Mother as to a conductor of God's power, as to a spiritually liberated being, who is between the worlds for the sake of spiritual liberation of the human souls. And it is only upon union of diligence and work on oneself of the spiritual seeker and the power of God's Mother, AllatRA, came together that the personality merged with the soul, that is, a person attained liberation of his soul, the seventh dimension, or, as they say in Christianity, paradise, the kingdom of the Father and the Son. And it only depends on the choice of a person whether the sign will be active and whether the person will be worthy of receiving this divine power that will lead him to God. The key is given for the purpose of being used. And in order to use the key, it is necessary to invest one's effort in this. So such is the way of a spiritual person, the way of burning spiritual dispassion, which, only when coupled, together, with the creating power of God, leads to liberation. And this is known not only in Christianity but in other religions as well. This was known already in the ancient times when people had different names for God, His Son, and God's Mother, the Great Mother. After all, it is not about priestly conceptions from the mind and their epithets but in one and the same spiritual grains, on which all their religions stand. Here is a simple example. As I mentioned, not too long ago the cult of the goddess Isis, which originated in ancient Egypt, used to be very popular among different Eastern and Western folk. By the way, one just needs to turn one's attention to the art of ancient Egypt, to those of its patterns which have been preserved to this day in buildings, paintings of ancient temples, and sculptural images. And one can see the same symbols of passing down the basis of spiritual knowledge as everywhere around the world, the working AllatRA sign, lotus, circle, cube, diamond, pyramid, cross, square, a symbolic image of the four essences. So, the cult of the goddess Isis lasted more than 1 millennium, including the Roman Empire era. And where is the real reason for such popularity hidden? In active signs, The AllatRA sign, which was spread in those times through the cult of goddess Isis just like it is being spread today through the cult of God's mother. Primordial knowledge has long been lost for the most part, but symbols and signs have remained. Anastasia, yes, Isis as the Great Mother was often depicted precisely with the AllatRA sign on her head, as we have said, in the form of a cup-shaped crescent with horns pointing upwards, above which a circle is located like a protruding side of a pearl. Rigdan, this symbol indicates that this power belongs to the one who created everything in the universe. I have already said that a long time ago people denoted the concept of the One Supreme, the One Eternal, with the sound Ra. This is where later, with the emergence of priesthood, a god named Ra appeared, who, according to legends, emerged from the lotus flower that had risen from the world's ocean. The great goddess, who was called by different epithets, which were later transformed into names, initially acted as the conductive power of Ra, the One Eternal. At various times, besides Isis, the bearers of such a sign in ancient Egypt were goddess Hathor, a daughter of the sun Ra, her name means the home of heaven, goddess Iosaset, her name means the creating hand of God, the greatest among those, who emanates. It was considered, for example, that if a person tastes goddess Hathor's spiritual gifts, then this will give him more spiritual powers, and she will help him cross over from the earthly world to the other, spiritual, world. This is why the following epithets were bestowed upon her: the Great Mother, Goddess of Love, Spiritual Joy, the One shining in the rays of Ra, the Great Woman, the Creator of all living things. Among additional associative designations that symbolized her were sycamore as the tree of life as well as symbols of eternal life, the colors green and blue which, as legends had it, were commanded by her. The latter is connected to the coded knowledge about the wave nature of man and the moment of spiritual transformation. Anastasia, yes, the same colors are present, as already mentioned, in the designation of the divine characters who, for different peoples, embody the cosmic order, the waters of life, fertility, the mother progenitress, and the creating divine power of the feminine principle. In the Christian religion, these colors are inherent to the Mother of God. The rhombus of Our Lady of the Burning Bush, Neopalamaya Cupina, for example, which has the image of the Virgin Mary, is also denoted by green or blue, navy blue, color. This indicates that one and the same basic knowledge was passed down from generation to generation, from nation to nation. Incidentally, there is this ancient word, glavka, which the ancient Greeks had borrowed in their time for their mythology from the peoples who once lived on what today are Slavic territories, to denote the creating power of the divine principle connected with water, which also commanded green and blue colors. Rigdan, I will say even more. In order to explain to people the knowledge of the invisible world, one had to refer to associations and images that could be understood by residents of the three-dimensional world. In the ancient times, the Great Mother, Goddess, as the creating power of the spiritual nature of a human being, whose reflection eventually became, for instance, that same Isis, who was represented as a woman, was initially depicted in a certain pose reminiscent of a sacred cube, when a person is sitting and hugging their knees. From above, the cube was crowned with a head, indicating its top. And the AllatRA sign was placed on the head or on one of the facets of the cube itself. The essence is simple. This is a symbolic depiction of the path of spiritual liberation of the personality when it merges with the soul, regardless of the body in which the person is located, for example, his gender, race, and so on. This is how the Foremother was originally depicted in ancient times, sitting in cubical position. Moreover, she was placed on a square, flat base. The cube meant the spiritual world, which a person can reach with help of the divine power of the feminine principle, Allat, and qualitatively change his nature, becoming another one, spiritual being. It also meant the 6 dimensions, in which the human structure was located. The flat square stone is the earthly material world, and also four corners as an indication of the four main human essences. Later, when people started imitating this, priests began to reproduce, immortalis for the sake of earthly glory, their faces in the form of cubic sculptures. Later, when in that same ancient Egypt, gods began to be portrayed in the form of personalized sculptures, then in order to reflect their divine essence, the god's figure was placed on a cube. And if it was necessary to indicate a connection between earthly and heavenly, divine, then it was put on a cube, which was placed on a flat square. If the figure was placed simply on a flat square, that meant only the earthly aspect of existence. Such initial cubical statues, as well as their variations of the rhombic types, in their time, were quite widespread canonical sculptural images not only in ancient Egypt but also in other parts of the world. 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 9 8 10 11 12 13 14. Figure 98. Cubical statues and symbols of the ancient world. A cubical sculpture of a Paleolithic Venus figurine. A Chinese sculpture in the form of a cube placed on a corner, made of jasper stone. In ancient China, jasper was revered as a pure stone, symbolizing heaven. It was believed that a person, while following the path of self-perfection, should create, smelt out, in himself as a means to attain immortality, which in the Chinese treatises was called a wonderful pearl, a jaspidian jewel, which would transform his whole body and make him clean and immortal, jaspidius. Paleolithic cubical sculpture of a goddess in a sitting position with knees bent and arms wrapped around her knees. Symbols are drawn on the body. As a rule, she was depicted without a face and sometimes without a head. A fragment of the image Judgment of Osiris on an ancient Egyptian papyrus. In ancient Egypt, people, animals, and gods were traditionally depicted in profile. Terracotta figurines of people sitting in a pose with knees bent and arms wrapped around them, artifacts of the Harappan civilization. An Neolithic object with a central rhombic symbol. A ritual Neolithic cubical shape with a geometric ornament, standing supported by four legs. The top is decorated as a symbolic image of 6 dimensions. A cubic statue of a sitting person, on which there is an image of the ancient Egyptian god of wisdom Thoth, in the form of a baboon, with the AllatRA sign, 4th to 1st centuries BC, the Karnak Temple, Thebes, Egypt. A bronze statuette in form of a cube, on which, enthroned, with knees bent and arms wrapped around them, sits the ancient Egyptian goddess of truth and justice, of the universal harmony and order Ma'at, the 12th to 11th centuries BC, ancient Egypt. A cubic statue of the scribe Ka with the AllatRA sign, 2nd millennium BC, Abydos, ancient Egypt. A figure of the Aztec goddess of water, Chalchiatlicue, 15th to 16th centuries BC, Mexico, Central America. A figure of the Aztec lord of the year, the god of fire. And volcanoes in the mythology of the Indians of Central America, Xiuhchicutli, 14th to 15th centuries BC, Mexico. Central America. A cubic figure of a person sitting in the lotus position, with symbols on the body, was used for anchoring a sacred pail. The bucket was discovered on a Viking ship, 9th century, Norway. A cubic statue of Senusret Senebifni, 2nd millennium BC, ancient Egypt. Anastasia, indeed, I have often encountered similar figurines of deities sitting in a cubic position among the archaeological finds discovered in different parts of the world. The figurines found in the Paleolithic layers, the so-called Great Mother, also sit in the same way, with legs tucked under and arms on the knees. Similar figurines were discovered among the finds belonging to the Harappan civilization. And what about the cubic figurines of ancient Indian and Chinese gods? Not to mention multiple artifacts of the Aztec, Olmec, and Maya in Mesoamerica. On territories where the Slavic people lived, figurines of the Great Foremother of the period of Tripoli civilization were found, where on her bosom there is a rhombus with a diagonal cross inside and with point centers. And another version of her portrayal has specific symbols of a truncated pyramid or two intertwined serpents which, taking into consideration, for example, ancient Indian knowledge about the power of the Kundalini serpent, symbolize the creating power of a human spiritual revival. Rigdan, by the way, two snakes curled up into a ball, for the ancients, were one of the original symbols of death and resurrection of nature, its renewal. Snakes, for instance, grass snakes, go below ground in the autumn and curl up into a large ball in earth's burrows, falling into hibernation, then wake up in the spring and leave the burrows, from below ground. That is why they served as an associative example for those people who wanted to understand what reincarnation, death, and resurrection of a human being are in the cycle of rebirths of his soul. Anastasia, yes, many peoples, especially in the East, revered the snake as a symbol associated with fertility. The feminine principle, earth, water, and also wisdom. If one considers this knowledge in the spiritual context, then everything falls into place. Regarding the Tripoli civilization, it is interesting that, for instance, ceramic jugs with sacred symbols were mostly of the rhombic form. If one carefully examines archaeological findings, one will find that the significant symbols and signs of spiritual development were depicted on such jugs: the circle, the crescent, with its horns pointing upwards, spirals, triangles, pyramids, wavy snakes, zigzag-like dividing lines, connection with water, in other words, with the other world, four pointed crosses, the sun and the moon, four suns. Moreover, according to archaeological excavations, every house of the Tripoli civilization had a cross-shaped sacred altar, in the form of the diagonal cross, where the first fire for the stove was kindled. It's the same symbol of the fire of the soul and the four essences. Rigdan, the rhombus form, is often found in the most ancient ornaments. It was called the symbol of unity of earth and heaven and was associated with lily and lotus. Anastasia, here, even if we trace the etymology of the word rhombus, we can discover interesting facts. This word is derived from the Greek rhombos, which means a spinning top, magic wheel, tambourine. In this regard, it suffices to recall the important symbolic role the tambourine played in magical actions, for example, among shamans. Moreover, usually, such a tambourine was decorated with, again, those same main symbols and signs. Rigdan, absolutely. By the way, it was believed that the shaman extracts the sacred sound from it with one hand, while holding in the other hand the crossbar of the tambourine, which, as a rule, had the form of a diagonal or equilateral cross. After all, according to the symbolism, it is the intersection of the circle and the cross that creates 8 faces, the octagon. The white shamans of Siberia had a belief, sacred knowledge, that if the square, that is, the signs of the 4 elements, is set into motion, then they may turn into the sign of eternity, circle. And in the West, in the ancient philosophy, the Greeks called the same process, quintessence, from the Latin word quinta essentia, the fifth essence, the theory of the fifth element. Anastasia, that is true, and it was called the primary ether, divine, eternal, and celestial, heavenly, being in the sky. Aristotle generally defined the quintessence as the thinnest element, the basic essence, the substance of the whole superlunary world, unlike the 4 elements of the sublunary world, which are subject to cyclicity of interconversion, emergence and destruction. Everything is so simple. It turns out that everyone is talking about the same thing, only using different words. Rigdan, of course, there is nothing difficult if you know. When you reach an understanding, everything becomes simple. Regarding shamans, you have noted quite rightly that in those times this knowledge and such a form of passing it down were natural for different peoples. But even earlier, this basic knowledge was known to the majority in the human society, and people did not need additional explanations, even if they lived in different parts of the planet. So then, a statue in the form of a cube symbolized the victory of a human spiritual nature over the material one, that is, of the spiritual nature over the animal nature. It also meant a spiritually mature person who is ready to perceive the divine word. The latter in those days was considered to be an inaudible sound, thanks to which God communicates with man, and spiritual enlightenment of man in the understanding of the One. That is, gods were sometimes depicted with an open mouth, but more often, corresponding signs were placed on their cubic statues. And later, when hieroglyphs appeared, they began to carve out communications to the One, who had an invisible nature. Anastasia, I believe that readers will be interested to learn that people knew already in those days about the primordial sound. Rigdon, of course, they did. After all, this is basic spiritual knowledge. What did, for example, a hieroglyph mean in ancient Egypt? It was initially considered to be a sacred sign, the divine word, the sign that indicated the sound. Moreover, hieroglyphs were written in a specific order and grouped in different square and rectangular shapes, which also had its meaning. Such writing was taught only in temple schools called houses of life. Let me remind you that the symbol of life, eternal life for the ancient Egyptians was the Ankh sign, which was called the key of life, key to eternity. By the way, this peculiar cross, as a symbol of immortality, was associated with water, the other world. It was known not only to the ancient Egyptian civilization but also in the Mayan civilization, ancient European peoples, for example, to the Scandinavians. It is interesting that the ancient Egyptian scribes themselves who applied sacred signs, as a rule, were depicted in the lotus position, sitting with crossed legs, on a square flat stone. The lotus position in ancient times was also conditionally called a pyramid. Figure 99. An ancient Egyptian statuette a scribe with a scroll. 19th to 18th centuries BC, Ancient Egypt, the Pushkin State. Museum of Fine Arts. Moscow, Russia. The ancient Egyptians had a special attitude to sound as a sacred manifestation of the invisible one who created everything. That is from whence they have this understanding, recorded in legends, that sounds awaken the universe, they awaken not only the soul but also the most beautiful thing in it, the connection with the invisible one. Anastasia, obviously, that is why in ancient Egypt there was a special veneration of music as of great creating power. Mentions have been preserved that in some religious ceremonies only women were trusted to fill the space with sacred sounds, for example, priestesses of goddesses Isis and Hathor, on whose heads, incidentally, there was the AllatRA sign. Rigdon, all this, of course, are external rituals, which, however, symbolized precisely the creating power of the divine Allat, which manifested the power of God, the primordial sound of creation, through the AllatRA sign. But the most important thing in all this theatrical action of associative transfer of spiritual knowledge is the attitude of believers and the working sign, which is seen by masses of people. Later, when knowledge began to be lost, initiated people started renewing it in the form that could be understood by the new generations. Then another image of the Great Mother Goddess became popular, already not in the form of a cube but in the form of a woman sitting on a face of a parallelepiped, the hexagon whose opposite facets, which symbolized 6 dimensions, are equal and parallel, like with the cube. Moreover, the emphasis was placed on the fact that the goddess sits exactly on the top of this symbolically depicted cube, by marking or highlighting with ornament one of the vertices of the cube. The feet of the goddess rested on a square flat stone. All this symbolized the connection between the earth and the sky. On the head of the Great Mother, there was always the AllatRA sign, which played a key role in the spiritual activation of the person looking at it. Spiritual symbols began to be placed in the hands of the Great Mother. For example, in the left hand there was the Ankh sign, key to eternity, and in the right hand there was the lotus flower with a long stem. Sometimes the goddess was depicted holding the symbolic left and right essences in her hands as a sign of victory over the animal nature, which was later replaced with a staff. The lotus was initially a symbol of the spiritual knowledge, spiritual practice, creating forces, perfection, and eternity in the one. That is why it was called the sacred flower, knowledge, of the radiant one, Ra. Many gods, and not only of ancient Egypt, were depicted sitting on the lotus flower. Incidentally, as I once mentioned, it is the lotus that was one of the first symbols of immortality and resurrection among different peoples in the meaning of spiritual transformation of a human. Later on, this was one way or another reflected in the religious beliefs of different cultures, for example, of ancient India, ancient Egypt, Assyria, Phoenicia, Hittites, and others. If a lotus bud was depicted, this meant potential capabilities of man during his lifetime. And if a ripe lotus seed pod was depicted, which has the form of an inverted truncated cone-shaped small pyramid, this meant the result of lifetime actions of man, a kind of fruit, a total, after his death. If this stalk with the seed pod was in the hands of a deity, then this meant a fruit-bearing power of creation. Besides, the lotus was often depicted together with the Great Mother, as scientists call her, goddess of the moon, so later they started drawing it in the form of a bowl. So, in the hands of the Virgin Mother of the ancient Egyptian culture, the lotus symbolized chastity, spiritual fertility, the virginal purity of the creating power of the feminine principle. Later there were different interpretations of the lotus flower in the hands of the great goddess, staff, the rod of spiritual power over matter, entwined by one or two serpents, a blossomed scepter, knowledge in the form of an open scroll, open book. Still later, goddess Isis began to be depicted in the following way: the palm of her right hand is pressed to the solar plexus, and with her left hand she holds the child, the son of the one, whose name is Horus, which means the one who is from the sky. Horus, as a creating god, was usually depicted with the head of a falcon. Anastasia, yes, we have already mentioned in a conversation that in the mythology of the peoples of the world, since ancient times the bird served as an association related to spiritual concepts, with a spiritual being who came from heaven, from another world, as well as with the human's front essence. For many peoples, drawing of wings as such meant the connection with other worlds, dimensions, the symbol of elevation of the soul into eternity of the spiritual world after death of the body in the material world. The image of the bird became an archetype for all winged creatures. Figure 100. Image of a statuette of the goddess Isis with child Horus. 12th century BC, Ancient Egypt, Hermitage Museum, St. Petersburg, Russia. Rigdan, absolutely. Besides, birds were also attributes of the gods who personified the struggle of the forces of light and darkness, who acted in the invisible world and induced the human choice to either side. That is why, since ancient times, the initiated divided birds symbolically. For example, falcons symbolized the forces of light, spiritual vigilance, and courage in action. Eagles symbolized the dark forces and struggle for the material power. But because of imitation and misunderstanding of the essence of these symbols, the symbolism of these birds practically merged and they were being substituted by each other in the human society. However, for an intelligent person, it is enough to look at the modern symbolism of the banners of states and international organizations. Are there many falcons to be found there? However, the number of eagles is countless. This is just another indirect confirmation out of numerous facts of what edge today's society stands on, who controls it, and what power is winning in this world. Anastasia, the high flight of the falcon in ancient Egypt, for example, was associatively compared to the flight of the soul in heavenly realms. It was believed that Horus as the son of Osiris and Isis was called to the human world to unite heaven and earth and to fight the forces of darkness. The embodiment of life force and the soul, Ba was represented in the form of a falcon with a person's head. And some gods, on the contrary, were depicted as people with a falcon's head. Rigdan, that is right. Such gods of ancient Egypt as, for instance, Ra and Montu were depicted in the ancient times in the form of a falcon-headed person, and on their heads, there was a sign of a circle. Their symbol was a winged sun disk, circle. It was an attribute of not only the ancient Egyptian Ra, Montu, and Horus, but later, As I have already mentioned, it was a symbol of gods of other peoples, for instance, of the supreme god of good for the ancient Persians, Ahura Mazda. So, returning to the topic of the symbolism of the Great Mother and the cube. The name of goddess Isis, for example, when translated from the ancient Egyptian language into Greek, means a throne, a seat. The Greek word thronos, in its turn, means a seat, a raised platform. This is precisely what has been connected with ancient images of the Great Mother, in the sitting position, in the form of a cube. The hieroglyph related to the name of Isis was depicted in such a way, as a side view of a flat square stone, a parallelepiped emphasizing the fact that the goddess sits at its very top corner. This throne, seat, is also often placed on the head of Isis as a designation of her name, which is one of the ancient epithets of the Great Mother, connected with spiritual elevation, a symbolic holy place, the connection of heaven and earth. And that is how the symbolic cube became a throne. Figure 101. Image of the ancient Egyptian falcon. A part of a pendant, the 7th century BC, ancient Egypt. Figure 102. Ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs of goddess Isis. The first symbol is a side view of the throne. And now it is enough to draw an analogy of what various religions call the place of becoming closer to God, to the highest enlightenment in self-perfection, and much will become clear. Buddha, for example, was depicted on the throne that was named with the epithets lotus and diamond throne. In Christianity, for example, instead of the word throne they used a word that was similar in meaning, prestel in English transcription, translator's note. The Old Slavonic word, prestel, is derived from the word, table, to spread, translator's note, moreover, meaning a sitting place and even a platform, connection with the Supreme. That is why there is such a saying, the throne, prestel, of God is heaven. Anastasia, the communion table, prestel, a quadrangular table with relics that is covered with a veil, is the main attribute of the Orthodox Church. It stands in the middle of the altar. Incidentally, it is interesting that many types of altar compositions represent precisely the Mother of God on a throne. Rigdon, exactly right. But it is worth noting that it is one thing to depict gods with typical symbols in order to pass down spiritual knowledge, and another are people with their insatiable thirst for material imitation and power. During the period of development of the political and priestly institution of power in human society, those in power, imitating ancient images of gods who were sitting on the throne, did not hesitate to surround their dear selves with all the symbols of God's glory, often without understanding its original essence. I will not even mention the civilizations of the East, Asia, and the West, Mesoamerica. In this regard, their history has enough of such facts. I will simply give an example of annalistic lore about the royal regalia in Rus, about the so-called throne of Monomaque, which has been preserved to this day. Earlier, the Tsarist throne was called Tsar's place. This was a symbol of supreme power. It was located not only in the prince's outer entrance hall, in the palace, but also in temples. In the temple, it was, as a rule, placed on the right hand of the holy gates of the iconostasis in the form of a marquee canopy, cover, on 4 pillars, where behind a separate entrance there was a fenced-in seat. And the pillars of this pyramidal throne were the figures of 4 animals. And which animals, at that? A fierce lion, Schemant, a monster beast, Yana, hyena, a vicious beast without turning neck, and 2 oskrogons, one has many knots and the other is also full of light to the brim. Figure 103. The Throne of Monomaque. The year 1551, the Dormition Cathedral of the Moscow Kremlin, Moscow, Russia. Anastasia, in other words, in the pillars of the Tsar's throne there were symbols of all 4 essences of man. The lion and the hyena are lateral essences, and the one that has many knots must definitely be the back essence. And what is the exact translation from the Old Slavonic of the last phrase? Rigdon, and the second one is full of light to the edge, limit, top, dot. Anastasia, that's precisely about the front essence. That's the old Slavonic ancient language for you, as they say, it's a shame not to know it. Rignan, regarding the four essences, for ancient Slavs, as I have already mentioned, this was nothing new. Their ancient deities, which in the era of propagation of Christianity began to be called pagan, fully reflected all this knowledge that was formulated in understandable to people associative form. For example, let us consider the Slavic deity Strobos, Stribog, the god of the four winds. The root of his name comes from the word to build, and its main function was defined as the organizer of good. The four winds of different seasons allegorically stood for the four human essences, those invisible intelligent spaces that try to dominate in him. At that, three of them are whirling vortices, creating wail and whistle, that spin in a swift dance to the sound of heavenly choirs. That is why later in the folklore, Russian incantations, people invented curses against a terrible devil, a violent whirlwind, and a flying fiery serpent. And the spring wind was associated with the front essence, with the first spring birds, messengers of good spirits, and with the singing and music of heavens. So all the tools were given so that people built good inside themselves. The rest already depended on their human choice. Anastasia, yes, it turns out that the associative concepts of ancient Slavs about the nature of the human spatial structure and his spiritual component were closer to the truth. For the wind as an element of tangible space comes the closest to characterizing the invisible nature of the four essences. Rignan, but what is even more interesting regarding the ancient Slavs, their knowledge was recorded not only in mythology but also in architectural buildings. Long before Christianity, in Rus there existed constructions of temples that later became known as tent-shaped. The Old Russian word, shatur, translator's note, is derived from the Turkic esatir meaning a tent, canopy. By the way, the ancient Indian word chatram means a barrier, veil, and was associated with the meaning of I open and close light. Anastasia, I open and close light. So, in fact, in the spiritual interpretation, this is key to heaven. Rignan, absolutely. So then, in the old Russian architecture, shatur was the name given to the finial of the centric buildings in the form of a tetrahedral or octahedral pyramid on the top of towers, temples, and even the front porch in an ordinary wooden house. This was a symbol, speaking in a modern language, of an active aspiration of man for the spiritual, heaven. In fact, this structure represented an octagon placed on quadrangle, allowing to make a transition of tiers of square base of, for example, a temple to its octagonal finial, marquee, on top of which a small cupola was placed as a topper with a hemisphere. Anastasia, a topper with a hemisphere. A finial on 8 facets with an indication of a cupola. That's exactly the top of the cube placed on its corner. These are true architectural symbols of pillars of light. Rignan, by the way, the word glavka, cupola, gave origin to the old Slavonic word glava meaning a head as the beginning of everything, the basis, the supreme, head honcho, head of the house, a chapter, head, of birch bark manuscripts, and later books, and so on. But in man himself, glavka was the crown of his head, the top of man. Anastasia, well, the crown of the head has always been marked as the thousand-petaled lotus chakran or, as it is called in India, the Sahasrara chakran which, when translated from Sanskrit, means 1,000 petals of a lotus. This is the human seventh chakran. Interestingly, the Hindus believe that it is here that the spiritual consciousness blocks the lower human essences which bind to earthly attachments and desires the soul that seeks eternity. It is with the help of this chakran that the unification with the Supreme as the final stage of the spiritual growth of the soul in the body shell takes place. It is here, according to the views of religious ascetics of India, that the awakening creative power of Kundalini, the Kundalini serpent, rising through the 6 chakrans, ends its path, and super enlightenment takes place, unification with super consciousness, the soul with God, the Supreme One. Rigdan, it is also worth paying attention to the symbol with which they mark this chakran, as a transparent diamond, from which subsequently the names the lotus, diamond throne of Buddha came from. Anastasia, each time I come across the ancient knowledge of Indo-European peoples, their wisdom and the depth of cognition of the spiritual essence never ceases to amaze me. Rigdan, various peoples, including the ones living on the present Slavic territories, have had this knowledge since ancient times. Moreover, what else was typical for the ancient Russian temples with such construction? They made quite a strong impression with their external symbols and scale of construction. But the inner space of these ancient temples was extremely small and not intended for populous worship. The incredible height over the crossing was emphasized in this inner narrow space of the temple. Often, it is to the foremother of this or that people that such temples were dedicated as to the creating power of the divine feminine principle. So their internal space also symbolized path of spiritual perfection in a human being himself. Anastasia, the ancient peoples that once lived on the present Slavic territories really had a rich spiritual heritage, as evidenced by archaeological findings containing the relevant spiritual symbols and signs dating back to the 12th to 4th millennia BC. It's just that today, obviously, it is to someone's advantage that modern people who live on those territories mistakenly believe that their ancestors supposedly descended from savage tribes who had no spiritual heritage. Rigdan, people should consider why such an opinion is being imposed upon them and their children, and why everything is being done to ensure that people themselves are not interested in something greater, in what they are not supposed to know as defined by those in power. Why, having the present technical capabilities of the civilization, the world's priests carry on with information attacks upon these people's consciousness, making Ivans who do not remember their kinship out of them. Anastasia, yes, if the Slavic peoples wake up from their spiritual slumber, then they, following the generosity of their soul, will spiritually awaken other peoples, and this all peoples awakening will affect the whole world. You had once told us some interesting information about the revelation of John. In particular, how he wrote the story of the apocalypse, using the Jewish priests' information, who had borrowed much from ancient Greek legends, religious beliefs of the Eastern peoples, including from Egyptian and Babylonian myths. I have included all this in the book Sensei 4. So, John, as you mentioned, also wrote about the throne set in heaven, on which there was the sitting one. Most importantly, he speaks of the same 4 apocalyptic beasts standing around the throne. Rigdan, yes, John also had he who is sitting, who looked like gemstones, like jasper and carnelian, and the glow of an emerald circled his throne like a rainbow. Of course, it is all the same. Again, the same colors of gemstones that symbolize goddess Isis and other conductors of AllatRA. Again, it is the same throne that was set in heaven, and the sitting one was on the throne, before the throne a sea of glass like crystal and 7 lamps of fire burning before the throne, which are the 7 spirits of God. In the middle of the throne, and about the throne, were 4 beasts full of eyes before and behind. And the first beast was like a lion, and the second beast like a calf, and the third beast had a face as a man, and the fourth beast was like a flying eagle. Each of the 4 beasts had 6 wings about him and were full of eyes inside and out. Without stopping day or night they were saying, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty, who was, who is, and who is coming. And when those beasts give glory and honor and thanks to him who sits on the throne, who lives forever and ever, the 24 elders fall down before him who sits on the throne, and worship him that lives forever and ever, and cast their crowns before the throne, saying, Thou art worthy, O Lord, to receive glory and honor and power, for thou hast created all things, and for thy pleasure they are and were created. John simply used the information of the Jewish priests. And the latter copied most of this knowledge from the legends of other peoples, having naturally appropriated them to form concepts from the mind and create their own religion. Only as a basis, he took the plot, naturally, not about the creating power of Allat for the living people but about the judgment of every person after death of his physical body. The ancient Egyptians called it the after-death court of the supreme god Osiris. The wife of the latter, I remind you, was considered to be goddess Isis. I once told you about Osiris. His name means one who is at the top. He is considered to be the lord of the afterlife world, who holds court over every human soul after earthly life, deciding its further fate. In the modern version of the translation of the papyrus text which tells about the afterlife court, the epithet of the person who enters this court sounds quite amusing, freshly dead. As they say, as the person understands life, so he translates into another language. The ancient Egyptians believed that life continues also after death of the physical body but in a different form and in a different space. This view was based on the knowledge that was once given to all people. The place of court, the transition state of human after the physical death, in the underworld was called by the ancient Egyptians as the Great Hall of Two Truths. Osiris at the court, as a being from the supreme spiritual world, was symbolically depicted sitting on a cubic throne, his feet resting on a square base. He judges from the top of the cube, to which, as a rule, points the marked corner of the cube. At the court, in the Great Hall of Two Truths, the four defenders of Osiris' throne are also present. Anastasia, I remember you once showed us a copy of the papyrus with an image of the court of Osiris. There were also the four defenders of the Osiris throne in the underworld who stood on a lotus flower before the judge. Rigdon, indeed. According to the legend, they are sons of the son of Osiris, of Horus, Horus meaning one who is from the sky. Each of them is protected by a certain goddess who is depicted as a winged woman. The names of the sons of Horus are Amzet, Happy, Duamutef, and Kabasanuf. Amzet has a human face, Happy was depicted with the head of a monkey, Duamutef, with the head of a jackal, Kabasanuf, with the head of a falcon. These main four are consistently mentioned in the pyramid texts, in the coffin texts, in the Book of the Dead, and other religious and magical literature of the ancient Egyptians. Of course, already a large part of the spiritual knowledge has undergone changes and distortions due to interpretation from the mind with domination of the material thinking, but nevertheless, some echoes have remained. Figure 104. The Court of Osiris. Diagram of an ancient Egyptian image on papyrus 6th century BC. The Book of the Dead, Hermitage Museum, St. Petersburg, Russia. In the original spiritual sense, these are precisely the four main human essences. This is exactly the part of the human structure, the real witnesses of the invisible world that, like flight recorders of the aircraft, record all of the overt and covert deeds of the personality, thoughts, choices, and preferences during the spent life. The back essence, Amzet, was depicted in the human form as a symbol of all of the human past, the past life of different personalities, subpersonalities, in the earthly reincarnations of the soul. John describes it in the following way: the beast had a face like a man. The right essence, Happy, was depicted with the head of a monkey, Hamadryas baboon, as a symbol of wildness, herd instinct, manifestations of animal instincts, strength, anger, and aggression. John describes it as the beast like a calf, a herd animal. The left essence, Duamutef, with the head of a jackal is a symbol of a highly developed animal, of lightning-fast attack, dexterity, intelligence, and cunning. John describes it as an animal like a lion. In general, it should be noted that in the associative image of a jackal, the ancient Egyptians very accurately captured the main characteristics of the left essence during its attacks on a person with the corresponding thought forms. Because the jackal also deftly sneaks up on the victim unnoticed and seizes it sharply. It is characterized by audacity and insolence of sudden attacks. It can even seize a bird rising into the air from a high jump. Besides, it is very loud. This beast produces a whining cry when it goes hunting. It howls so loudly that the animals nearby begin to repeat it and to whine in response. And finally, the symbol of the front essence is Kabasanuf with the head of a falcon. John described it as a living creature like a flying eagle. An eagle is already a comment from the priesthood. The falcon was indeed a symbol of spiritual freedom of the person who was aspiring for the spiritual path, upwards, heavenward, towards liberation of his soul. It was also a symbol of inspiration, ascension through all the levels, and victory over matter. In Egypt, it was the falcon that was the king of birds, the heavenly nature, one of the first manifestations, a symbol of God Ra. And for many other peoples, such as the Incas, it was also a solar, sun, symbol that guarded the spiritual path of man and strengthened his spirit. This was compared to the falcon's ability to soar high and long, to be close to the sun. In the Book of the Dead, these four essences are also called masters of the truth and verity, the supreme princes standing behind Osiris's back, the pillars of Shu. Shu, according to cosmological legends, is the one who once raised the sky from the ground and is holding it up, that god of air that divides heaven and earth, in the sacred legends about man, a designation of his shadow in the invisible space. They were placed on the lotus flower, and later, at the sides of the throne, behind the throne, or in front of the throne. John has it as in the midst of the throne and around the throne. 1 2 3 4. Figure 105. The four essences at the court of Osiris, fragment of the court of Osiris drawing. The back essence, Amzet, with a human head. The right essence, Happy, with the head of a monkey, Hamadryas baboon. The left essence, Tuamutef, with head of a jackal. The front essence, Kabasanuv, with head of a falcon. Anastasia, back then, you had mentioned that in front of the one sitting on the cube, Osiris, there is the symbolically depicted animal mind, in the form of a lion, as well as a faded lotus flower on the altar. Of the latter, only the seed vessel remains, on which, as a matter of fact, stand these four essences. Rigden, that is right. As I have already said, the lotus in this form was usually depicted as the symbol of the spiritual result of the personality's life path after the death of its body. A lotus with petals is a symbol of active life, and when petals fall off, the essence remains, the spiritual seeds that man gains during his lifetime. The image of the papyrus symbolically shows four main essences, like witnesses, standing on this essence. They are, simply put, the information about each day the person has lived, so to speak, second by second. The notation above them, as a rule, displays symbolical marks of the count of thoughts and deeds, sins, of a person, recorded by each essence. This is a kind of conditional indicator of the quantitative equivalent of the active domination of each essence during the life lived by the personality. It is impossible to hide anything, all the secrets are revealed. These four essences become like silent witnesses that never lie. All the person's deeds, thoughts, emotions, experiences, all the temptations, what the person was seduced by, and what he chose throughout life, all is there before the judge. Figure 106. Silent witnesses before the judge, which are standing on a lotus flower. A fragment of the court of Osiris image. Anastasia, it is interesting that the ancient Egyptian papyrus clearly showed that the human soul does not take part in this process, it only awaits its fate according to the results of the testimonies of the four essences while being on the scale. Rigden, yes, usually next to it near the bowl, the symbol of the front essence was additionally depicted, a figure with the head of the falcon, indicating its involvement in the weighing, thus associatively demonstrating how active it was during the person's lifetime. And one of the essences of the animal nature, the back, the right, or the left one, was, as a rule, put near the opposite scale, on which there was a figure of the goddess of justice and truth, Ma'at, or its attribute, a feather. Here, the dominant essence of the animal nature was depicted, showing how active it was during the entire human life. Most often, the left essence, the jackal-headed figure, was depicted in this place. It is considered to be the oldest one, the one leading the back and the right essences, and the cleverest hypostasis of the animal nature in man. Figure 107. The weighing of the soul. Fragment of the Court of Osiris image on the scale which the jackal-headed figure, the left essence, Duamutef, is holding onto. There is a figure of the goddess of justice and truth, Mot, on the scale which the falcon-headed figure, the front essence, Quebecanuf, is holding onto. There is the ancient Egyptian symbol of depicting the soul. Above the scale is the god Thoth, the god of wisdom, counting, and writing, the lord of time, which the ancient Egyptians also depicted in the form of a baboon. According to the legend, Thoth recorded the days of birth and death of people, recorded chronicles, and at the court he recorded the result of the weighing of the soul of each person. Anastasia, if we view this from the perspective of spiritual knowledge, it turns out that these essences at first provoke certain thoughts in a person during his lifetime, and then, based on his choice, they record to what he pays the most attention and gives life energy. And after his death, they, so to speak, rat out his personality at this court. Rigden, that is how it is. However, this court takes place not in the way people have made it up, explaining the processes of the invisible world to each other through associative images that people of the three-dimensional world can understand. These are simply inevitable processes for every personality, taking place, shall we say, at the level of energy and information, which awaited after death of the physical body. Anastasia, so, if during its lifetime the personality mostly chose the animal nature, activating mainly its back and lateral essences, then, in fact, it became a sealed subpersonality, and the soul was again immersed in the material world of the animal mind, that is, its reincarnation occurred and another confinement in the material body. Rigden, indeed, the soul was again confined, using the language of religion, in hell. In ancient Egypt, for example, this was symbolically depicted as devouring, swallowing, the soul by the monster called Amat. This monster personified the animal world of intelligent matter in its image, moreover, indicating the three dimensions of the world into which the soul was sent. In particular, Amat had the traits of three animals, the crocodile, the lion, and the hippopotamus. That is, simply put, the soul was sent to reincarnation, returning once again to the earthly life of the three-dimensional world. And if activation of the front essence outweighed during the human life, then the soul became free. According to the ancient Egyptian beliefs, it was sent on the solar ship, that also was called the ship of eternity, the ship of million years to Uru, Eelu, Elysian fields, paradise, that is, to another, spiritual world. Anastasia, and if we consider that the ancient Egyptians, just like other peoples, such as the Tripoli civilization, depicted the solar ship in a form of AllatRA sign, a crescent with a circle, the smile of Ra, then the comparison becomes quite intriguing. The one who had once given this knowledge obviously knew much more about the dimensions of the universe and the spiritual world than was subsequently reflected in the religious concepts and beliefs of those peoples. Rigden, all this exists and it all has always been. All this is the symbolism of the real energy processes which take place when the personality, together with the soul, leaves the body after its physical death. It is just that all this was explained for a spiritually immature person, for the logic of his material mind, using associative examples of the three-dimensional world, which the society of that time could understand. Anastasia, yes, it turns out that there it is impossible to change anything. What you have chosen here for yourself is what you get there. Life is indeed a very responsible business. Trials, the burden, of life are truly given according to my strength and nothing beyond that. And the main thing is that I understand that, in fact, it is not difficult for me to control myself here and now, ignore these provocative whispers of the back and the lateral essences. Because it is all in my hands. It is I who chooses whether to listen to them or not. I just need a little more control on my part, If some quality of the animal nature has manifested itself somewhere, I mustn't allow it to develop in me. I must focus more in this moment on positive thoughts and do more spiritual and constructive deeds during the day. This has been said from century to century. We can recall, for instance, recent periods. Let us take, for example, lines from Jesus' biblical Sermon on the Mount, "The lamp of the body is the eye." So then, if your eye is clear, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eye is evil, your whole body will be full of darkness. Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Rigdon, quite true. Already the one who reaps is receiving rewards and gathering fruit for eternal life, so that sower and reaper can rejoice together. This, in one form or another, is said in almost all the traditional religions of the peoples of the world that have spiritual grains. For example, in the Holy Book of Islam, the Quran, the following things are mentioned. The Almighty, having created the heavens and the earth in 6 days, placed on the water surface his magnificent throne, which covered the heavens and the earth and from which he directs his creation. His throne was rested on the water so that he may test to find out which of you is the best in deeds. Surah 11, verse 7. Moreover, the throne is referred to by two terms, kursi, a throne, an elevated sitting place, and arsh, the highest place that embraces all that exists and is above it. Arsh embraces kursi and is located above it. According to the Muslim beliefs, it is thought that the throne now rests on the shoulders of 4 greatest angels supporting it. According to the legend, these angels have different faces. One of them has the face of an eagle, the second one, of a lion, the third one, of a calf, and the fourth one, of man. The Quran mentions that angel Jabrail, who passes on the revelations of the Almighty to prophets, including in the form of scrolls and books, and who comes to help in case of need, tells Muhammad about the spiritual mysteries of the human soul, waging its fight in space and time, about reward and retribution for each person on Judgment Day for the deeds in the earthly world. Surah 17, which tells the story of Muhammad's ascent to the 7th heaven thanks to angel Jabrail, has such words. Ayah 11. Man prays for evil as fervently as he ought to pray for good. For mankind is ever hasty, in being unwise. Ayah 15. He who follows the direct path, follows to his own advantage. But he who goes astray by delusion, from that path, does so to his own loss. And no laden soul will bear another's load. And no one ever was punished by us, until a messenger was sent, to them, with a warning of punishment and a message about the right, direct path. Here, it is worthwhile paying attention to these and the following lines, from the summit of understanding of the already available knowledge. For example, knowledge of characteristics of the human structure in 6 dimensions, the activity of persons' 4 main essences, including their testimony at the afterlife court, about the aspiration of the human soul for eternity, its desire to live the last life in the material world, about the many desires of the animal nature which block the soul in transient lives and are stimulated by the 3 essences for the purpose of implementing the human choice. Ayah 18. He that desires benefits of life, transient, temporary, we will immediately deliver to him those things, to whomsoever we also wish, as we please. And, only, then we will assign to him hell, where he will burn, outcast and despised. Ayah 19. He that desires the life of the hereafter, and looks for eternity of the future world, and strives for it, as it ought to be striven for. Being a believer in God with his whole soul, he is the one whose striving with benediction will be accepted by God. Anastasia, yes, the meaning is deep. So, Jabrail spoke about the activity of these 4 essences in relation to a human being. That is, if the person gives attention and wishes for what the right, the left, and the back essences suggest to him, he will get what he desires. Only, he will then have to answer for his choice with his own sufferings, having become a subpersonality in reincarnations, in hell, burn outcast and despised, burdening the soul with new enslavements in matter. And if a person wants to break the cycle of earthly reincarnations and escape into the eternity of the spiritual world, and he tries in his life to do everything in his power to develop spiritually, so that this earthly life becomes the last one for him, then he has a chance to be accepted in the spiritual world. Yes, such wise lines of the Quran truly reflect the spiritual essence, which has come down to the present day from the depths of the ages. It's just that many people, especially the young generations, are unfamiliar with such spiritual literature of different peoples as, for example, the Vedas, the Avesta, Tripitaka, the Bible, and the Quran, for that matter, just like I was at their age. That's why many of them don't even know that information about the Judgment Day is in Quran as well. Written, of course, about the Judgment Day, and about the book of all the actions of a person during his lifetime, and about the justice scales. For example, Surah 99, the earthquake, Aziz al-Zala, Ayah 7 and 8, says, whoever has done, at least, an atom's weight of good shall see it there, get requital for it. And whoever has done, at least, an atom's weight of evil shall see it there, get requital for it. Each person will give an account of his thoughts, actions, and deeds. The world of Islam knows to this day the words of the Prophet Muhammad, on the Judgment Day, man will not escape the place of the account until he answers 4 questions. How did you spend your life? How did you use your body? How did you earn and use your property? How did you use your religious knowledge? Anastasia, in actuality, this is an account that is related to the 4 essences. Because the back essence, the human past, is how you have spent your life. The right essence is the animal instincts of man, how a person used his body. The left essence is the thirst for power and numerous earthly desires associated with it. The front essence is how the person developed spiritually throughout his entire life. Written, absolutely. In Surah 21, the Prophets, Al-Anbiya, Ayah 47, it says, on resurrection day, we shall set up scales of justice so that no one will be dealt with unjustly in any way, not even as small as a grain of a mustard seed. For none can take account of deeds, as we do. Anastasia, indeed, people see only the outer religious shell of the faiths unknown to them, but do not even try to grasp the essence of spiritual grains that are laid there. Written, unfortunately, that is so. Mentions of the soul's 2 paths, the true and the false one, exist also in the ancient Indo-European mythology. They have also been preserved in the Upanishads treatises, which are considered to be the final part of the Vedas, where sacred knowledge and explanations of the secret inner meaning of the spiritual path are laid out. This work is the basis of the orthodox religious philosophical systems of India. The ancient Iranian religion of Zoroastrianism, the sacred book of which is the Avesta, also talks about the man's personal judgment after death of his body. In particular, it is mentioned that the after-death fate of man depends entirely on how many righteous good thoughts, words, and deeds he has accumulated during his life. 3 days after death of the body, the human soul goes to the bridge of requital, Shinvat, for the judgment which is executed by the sons of Ahura Mazda, Mitra, Sriyasha, and Rashnu. The actions committed by the person during his earthly life are weighed on the scales by Rashnu, the spirit of righteousness, direct, honest. By the way, according to religious treatises, Ahura Mazda had 4 sons, Mitra, Sriyasha, Rashnu, and Ashi, the essence of the truth, the true law of the universe. The Ashi term was also used in the meaning of the name of the goddess of fate, truth, and justice. Ancient Iranian legends mention that each person after death, at the entrance to the other world, would always meet his Dana in a female form, the embodiment of his inner spiritual world. Only for the righteous it appeared as an image of a beautiful girl, and it was believed that the righteous person passed as if through 4 steps, beginning with the first step, into the heaven of good thoughts, with the second step, of good words, with the third one, of good deeds, and after the fourth step, he reached infinite light. And those who wasted their lives on the earthly, amassed for themselves bad thoughts, words, and deeds, were considered cursed souls. For such a burdened soul, Dana appeared in the form of a dreadful old woman. Such a soul passed through 3 hells of evil thoughts, words, and deeds, and ultimately, at the 4th stage, it faced the supreme deity of the evil of Ahriman and his helpers. Anastasia, even though this is a legend, a lot of real information has been put into it. Rigdon, well, the purpose of creating legends was to pass information, even through those who do not understand it. So, different world religions, such as Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, Zoroastrianism, and Hinduism, in one form or another, speak about this, so to say, personal judgment, which not a single living person will escape after death of his physical body. This knowledge is and was present among almost all the peoples of the world, although it was expressed differently. For example, since ancient times, the notion judgment, court among the Slavs was used to mean fate and, later, deities associated with the human destiny. It was believed that the court holds in its hands all that is good and disastrous and that its sentences are impossible to avoid neither with mind nor with cunning. Anastasia, to this day, different peoples interpret the concept of judgment, just like in the ancient Indian language, as connection and unity. For example, the ancient Scandinavians and Germans interpreted it as a strait, a place that you can swim across, and the Greeks as a vault. Rigdon, absolutely right. By the way, in the religious beliefs of ancient Greeks, the supreme god Zeus was the leader of the goddesses of fate, Moiras. It was believed that all the people have Moira, the Greek word mu omicron rho alpha iota from mu omicron rho alpha means fate, destiny. In early religious beliefs, they called it the inevitable law of nature, the divine predestination. According to the beliefs of the ancient Greeks, Zeus ruled over the earth and below it and passed judgment on the dead. It was mentioned that the behests of the human fate were often unknown to Zeus, and it was only on golden, celestial solar, scales, where one scale embodied human life, and the other one stood for death, that he learned his fate. Zeus himself remained indifferent to the weighing results. And for the living people, he took the good and the evil out of the 2 vessels, and handed them out blindly to people, at random. In the Chinese beliefs, there are mentions of the books of fate, which are stored in the other world, where the main events and the duration of life are indicated for each living person. In the Sumero-Akkadian religious beliefs, it was thought that to die meant to meet your Shimta, in other words, that which invisibly accompanied a person throughout his entire life and which determined his further fate. By the way, there were the concepts of Sheju and Allat as 2 opposing forces that were embodied in the human life force, defining his character and destiny. At that, the word Allat was used in the meaning of creation. And such examples are quite numerous. Anastasia, you once mentioned that none of the popular beliefs in the ancient world, none of the world religions would have become so widespread among people had they not included information about the invisible world, the human structure, about the spiritual stages of human development, about the responsibility of the personality for the life spent and the cautions about the consequences of its choice. Rigdon, religion is only an external form, the variety of which was invented by priests at different times, mainly for the implementation of their earthly goals. However, the foundation for the superstructure, as such a form of different speculative concepts, was the spiritual knowledge which was passed down from generation to generation by different peoples. Otherwise, these religions would not have been attractive to the masses. With their soul, at the inner level, people do feel the real spiritual grain, no matter what husks from the human mind priests use to cover it up with. Anastasia, yes, you have repeatedly told us that after death of the person's body, whether he likes it or not, personal judgment on him takes place in the invisible world. As I understand, in religious concepts, for example, of Christianity, Islam, and Zoroastrianism, there is a fusion of notions of personal judgment over a person after his death and the overall judgment of mankind which you have mentioned before, saying that a collective judgment day has been set for the entire living humankind. Rigdon, quite right. These are the times of the crossroads. This was foretold a long time ago in different prophecies, that at a certain time while people are alive, the collective judgment will take place for the entire humanity. Anastasia, in the book Crossroads, I wrote about these prophecies, which are coming true today and which existed among the different peoples of the world, the Sumerians, the Mayans, divination of the bird man, the Celts, divination of the wheel of times, the ancient Persians, and so on. By the way, the Persians in Zoroastrianism, too, like you've said, preserved a lot of information about the afterlife, the resurrection, the collective judgment day, Frashegird as meaning making, the world, perfect. According to the beliefs of the Zoroastrians, 3 Saoshyants must come into the earthly world. Saoshyant is an Avestan word, a participle of the future tense of the verb to save. The first 2 Saoshyants will have to restore the teachings of Ahura Mazda at the end of times. And then the last Saoshyant will come for the final battle with bearers of evil and execute the terrible judgment. There is also information that by the end of times, when the circle of millennial evolutions is exhausted, when Asha triumphs, the truth, justice, good, heaven on earth can finally set in, where people will live happily, the earth will become like a valley, there will be one language, one law for all people. And that every righteous person brings this event of the world's transformation closer with his thoughts and deeds. From today's perspective, all these predictions do not seem to be legends at all. Rigdon, yes, everything depends on people themselves, on their choice. It is just that today most people do not understand all the importance of these processes, the importance of personal spiritual transformation, which not only can open the path to eternity for man but will also invariably entail transformation of the world around him. Predictions about the Judgment Day have existed for a long time. Priests, while creating this or that religion, also included them in their concepts. But they used this knowledge for their material purposes, emphasizing the fact that if you believe only in their religion, you will save yourself after your death, having risen from the dead in a bodily resurrection on Judgment Day. Well, what have these material substitutions from the human mind led to? To the fact that today some simply laugh at it, others think irresponsibly that this will happen later, and after my death at that, and when will that one, the only day of judgment happen anyway? Still others are killing one another for their faith, fanatically and with animal instinct, thinking that they will be rewarded there for it. While the majority of believers were simply forced to behave passively, with the idea imposed upon them that they needed to be in the herd of only this religion and no other, and everything will be decided for them with a battle somewhere over there in heaven between angels and demons. All these are tricks of the animal mind and distortions from the priests who crave for earthly power. Actually, in the other, spiritual world, there is no division between the material and the spiritual natures, there is only the spiritual there. Division and struggle exist in man himself because a part of the spiritual world, the soul, is placed in the material body. Angels and demons, with which priests frighten people, coming up with different guises for them, all this is, in fact, man's choice of this or that will, the will from the spiritual world or the will from the animal mind, which he accepts and which he then considers to be his own. With this choice, man determines his further lot in the decisive inner battle. All the same processes are also projected onto the society. At that, it is much easier to win against the animal nature in society as a whole than for each person to conquer it inside himself. The judgment day for mankind is not one day but the sum grand total to which humanity has arrived, all of the society, from its first day until the last one. This is the judgment of the living over the living, which people personally carry out over themselves in the time of global cataclysms and changes on earth that are related to cosmic phenomena. Anastasia, yes, If society had the spiritual vector of development today, and if at the head it had the idea of universal unity on the basis of friendship and mutual help among the nations, then indeed, taking into account the current technical capabilities, it would have a chance to survive this period. But with such a discord which we have right now, and because politicians and priests stir up animosity among the nations, it is unlikely that the society will have a future. But everything is actually in people's hands. You once mentioned that in the life of a real human, there is always a place for a heroic deed. As people say, the soul is a measure for everything. Rigdon, that is right. Unfortunately, the modern world leaves much to be desired. Although, everything flows, everything changes. As practice shows, ideas of global scale are implemented only when they are based on the common aspirations and actions of the majority of people, on consolidation of efforts in common interests of different groups. So people themselves can still change the situation, where there's a will. Anastasia, so what do people lack for such a spiritual feat of arms for the sake of the future of the entire humanity? Perhaps, the society lacks primordial knowledge, which, in fact, once united all the people in their main spiritual aspirations. Rigdon, I have already said, but still I will outline in general terms a summation of what has been said previously. Given the existence of signs, symbols, and certain spiritual grains in different cultures, anyone can make a conclusion that the knowledge as such has existed at all times. Moreover, it still exists now. And if a person truly desires for the spiritual, he can find it. But the thing is that modern man with his material worldview is a product of the present day's society. And currently the society, unfortunately, has a consumer format of thinking, where more often people become victims of the animal mind, conductors of its will, slaves on its galleys. After all, while in the state of domination of the animal nature, even in the spiritual knowledge, the person will see yet another opportunity for material gain, for satisfaction of his significance, and other qualities of the animal nature. This means there will be numerous substitutions and an absence of real spiritual growth even given availability of knowledge as such. We will not even go deeper into history. Let us consider a simple example with your books, which, in fact, is typical for the situation in general. No sooner had they come out than, besides the people seeking knowledge, there immediately appeared those ones who started to use the knowledge from these books to raise their personal image and strengthen their authority, to hype their concepts from the material thinking, to satisfy their megalomania and their significance. Some of them, using this knowledge as cover, started to call themselves teachers or servitors, thus trying to earn if not money for this information, then at least some personal authority. The knowledge, however, is given in the book exactly for the purpose of being disseminated among people in its pure form, without intermediaries who pontificate from their mind and distort the essence of the knowledge out of ignorance or lack of understanding. One can certainly feel sorry for these people. For it is the spiritual nature that encourages them to share the information received with people. But their thinking, encoded with foundations and postulates of prior experience, gained in different religions and sects, redirects this desire and power emanating from the soul into the already drawn in their consciousness material direction. So they create an entire bacchanalia, they try to teach others and prescribe how they should meditate, while being selfish by nature, without understanding themselves. They believe that they are allowed to make changes to the meditation techniques, to combine, distort, and modify them based on their previous experience gained in different shady institutions of occult and religious character. In general, they try to teach others from their human mind. But things remain unchanged. Precise tools are given in the books, but these people, because of their ignorance, try to spoil them. But as it is known, one cannot build a good thing with a bad tool. Besides, this is happening now, during your life before your very eyes. And what will happen in 100 years, not to mention millennia, if, of course, this civilization will have this time? Anastasia, yes, that's true. Unfortunately, Such people are many. But still there are many more of those people who have been inspired by the depth of this knowledge, who try to change themselves, become human beings, who selflessly distribute this information. There are people who practice meditations from the books without distinguishing themselves from among their friends, with whom they are walking the spiritual path, even if they have a little more experience in these practices than their mates. Such people do not shout right and left, but their spiritual toil, first of all on themselves, can be seen by their deeds and actions. Rigden, it is good that such people exist. It is for them that the primordial knowledge is given. Spiritual tools must be used for self-development and for the pursuit of the supreme. So, the knowledge does exist in the society, and what is missing is just switching the dominant from the perspective of the animal nature to the spiritual nature. What is lacking is the firm choice each day and independent work on yourself. After all, unless a person himself wants to change, just for himself personally and not for boasting to people, and gets practical experience of work on himself and of control over his thoughts and desires, he will get tangled in a multitude of distorted theories and practices, which have been mutilated beyond recognition, like in a sticky cobweb. When a person comes in contact with true spiritual knowledge, he discovers its simplicity, depth, and naturalness for himself. But, as it is known, theory is dead without practice. It is not enough to just know about something, one also needs to be able to apply this knowledge in practice. Spiritual work on oneself is multifaceted in every day. It involves not only work with spiritual tools but also developing purity of thoughts, deeds, and actions that are worthy of the title of a human being. In absence of such all-encompassing work on oneself, even if the person has received knowledge, after some time he will question himself, so now I received some knowledge, I've been doing some practices, but what has changed? That is, having this knowledge will only disturb him with other questions from the mind. But why? Because when a person does not work hard on his own spiritual transformation, he is filled with the secret hope that this knowledge will help him change or improve his material life. Anastasia, in other words, such a person expects quick visible changes for himself in the material world. Rigden, perfectly true. But what can change in that narrow range of the three-dimensional world that he sees and perceives with his five material senses? A brick falling on his foot, for example, will cause the same pain, heat and cold will bring discomfort to the body in the same way, the person will still feel the need for food and sleep. And his animal nature will terrorize him in the same way with thousands of desires and an appetite for all the pleasures of the material world. A person, while under the influence of the animal nature, subconsciously expects some material changes in his life, acquisition of magical power, which will give him satisfaction in something, secret influence over somebody,